There's the news flow, I have to say, over the last 2 weeks has been pretty terrific. What were you able to understand about what U.S. policy in the Middle East will be?
Well, it has been a whirlwind, and I think everyone watching this from outside the US understands that policy is moving fast and breaking things. It's also failing fast because quite a few of the things which have been announced over the last 18 days, some of them have been reversed immediately or changed pretty radically. So I don't think we know yet. It clearly hasn't settled down. Perhaps it never will. And the Gaza plan was perhaps the case in point, in the sense that people around the world were scratching their heads. I think Benjamin Netanyahu himself said that jaws were dropping. And I don't think it makes better sense today than when it was announced a few days ago. And the questions people are asking are much more about the short term in Gaza and the Middle East. We're only on phase one of that ceasefire deal. We need to get to phase two and the continuation of the release of the hostages and the stabilization of the position and continuing to get aid in. Those are the key things. And of course, President Trump may have a vision for a future Gaza. It's not clear how he gets there. It's not clear he's got regional buy-in or local buy-in for it. So I think we're a long way away from a plan. We may have a sort of half a vision, but this, it doesn't move the dial in terms of practical Middle Eastern politics yet.
Yeah, what does it mean for the region? If you look at some of the allies, when you look at Saudi Arabia and others, how are they going to react to this? It's quite unclear when allies, maybe former allies, deal with the new people in the White House and the new administration, what the right way to react is.
Well, I think you have to start deeper conversations. And I think that there have been hints from Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, during the week, of a discussion going on, frankly, within the US administration about how this can be turned into something concrete. And there are elements of it. Plainly, the reconstruction of Gaza is going to be a huge effort and an international effort. And if the US wants to get involved in a significant way, and the president, with his knowledge of the real estate business, can obviously play a huge part there, then I'm sure that in principle is to be welcome. But the idea that extending the McKinley doctrine of a century and a quarter ago to taking scraps of land around the world at will, that doesn't make sense today, even with the huge power of the United States behind it. And it contradicts one of President Trump's key ideas, which is the US shouldn't get itself involved militarily and excessively financially around the world. We don't want American retrenchment, but neither do we want America sort of lashing out internationally and trying to grab parts of the world. I'm sure that ultimately isn't his intention, but it clearly can't work without the expense of lives and resources for the United States, which he doesn't want and has been trying over both his presidencies to avoid. So there are some inner contradictions here. I think it requires much more discussion. But I think also the Netanyahu visit to Washington this week, in a sense, did let Israel off the hook. I mean, they need to be active participants in a discussion about what next after this very early stage of the ceasefire, which thankfully has been holding. Once that comes to an end, we need to move on and have very practical ideas for how Gaza is to be administered while the second phase gets going.
What do you think the tariffs are for? It's still unclear whether, part of it is just to get revenue in the country, or is it really 100% a negotiating tactic to get something else done?
I think it creates a mood around the world where people are prepared to think about really random, asymmetrical types of deals. I've heard talk of Ukrainian rare earths in return for American military support, and there's a sense, in which other countries which desperately need American involvement and support, they will think about those quite creative and exotic trades. So I think it softens people up for a transactional world in which pretty much everything is on the table, and there is a sense in which that's not necessarily a bad thing. But there's no doubt in my mind that the majority of economists, the majority of political analysts think that the threat of tariffs in itself has an unsettling and damaging effect on world trade and the world economy. And certainly that American consumers and American producers won't be magically let off if this tariff war increases and we get into real trade battles and confrontations around the world. So I think there may be some calculation in what the president's doing. For the most part, I think it's still his lifelong belief in tariffs, his belief that it helps the revenue situation of the US exchequer, and his belief that negotiation is a great thing and that this can soften people up for it.
I mean, I guess the concern is that, more than negotiation, that the president sees as a zero-sum game, so that he has to win, and that puts allies in a very difficult position. Ambassador, how do you think the UK-US relationship will look like this year?
Well, I think it's going to come under some pressure, inevitably. The US is one of the United States' absolutely key allies. You've got the Japanese Prime Minister coming to Washington as the second of President Trump's visitors. I'm sure Keir Starmer will be following shortly. We have a new ambassador arriving in Washington as well. So look, there are some fundamentals in the UK-US relationship which I don't think will change rapidly. But clearly, on Ukraine, on NATO, on tariffs, on handling the Middle East situation, the UK has interests as well and has views which it will want to get across to the administration, and that is going to be difficult for us as allies. I think getting across to the president that alliances aren't just there for talk about liberal values and the law and all those abstract things. They are there to ensure the protection of our countries, the security of our countries, and America gets something out of that, and American businesses get something out of the stability and the predictability which alliances create. So in his first term, there was a lot of talk about NATO, but NATO is still here today. European countries are contributing 30% more than they were 3 years ago to defense expenditure. So I think this is a different situation from the one he inherited in 2017. I hope you'll see the differences. And at the Munich conference next week, a very important moment where Europeans will start to see the color of the Trump administration's money in relation to Ukraine, and they will be hoping that at the end of it, America puts more pressure on Russia as the aggressor in this than they put on their allies in NATO and their partners in Ukraine.